Mail-order bride was sent back for being black, the crowd whispered, as the elegant woman stood abandoned on the dusty platform, her intended groom's rejection echoing across the stunned onlookers. The townspeople stared with mixture of fascination and disgust, their cruel whispers painting her as a deceiver who'd hidden her true nature. She would return east in shame, they assumed, with nowhere else to turn and no one willing to take her in. But from the edge of the crowd stepped the weathered rancher, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached with quiet determination. "Then, just be mine," he said simply, his words cutting through their prejudice like a blade. Their union would threaten to expose the deadly corruption poisoning the entire community, secrets powerful men would kill to protect. In a town built on lies and buried truths, would love and justice survive, or would they both be destroyed by forces darker than mere prejudice? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The stagecoach wheels kicked up clouds of red dust as they rolled to a stop outside the Willowbrook station. Maggie Johnson smoothed her dark blue traveling dress and clutched the worn letters from Harold Pembroke closer to her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped down onto the wooden platform. The Colorado Territory sun blazed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the small crowd that had gathered. Word traveled fast in frontier towns, and everyone knew about the mail-order bride arriving on the afternoon stage. Maggie's eyes swept across the faces, searching for the man who had written her such kind words about building a life together. She spotted him immediately. Harold Pembroke stood exactly as he had described himself in his letters. Tall, clean-shaven, wearing a pressed white shirt and black vest. His blue eyes met hers across the platform, and his expression shifted from anticipation to shock to disgust in the span of 3 heartbeats. Harold's face drained of all color. He took 2 steps backward, as if she carried some contagious disease. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Women pulled their children closer. Men shook their heads with knowing looks. "There's been a mistake," Harold announced loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice carried across the platform like a judge delivering a verdict. "This arrangement is void. You misrepresented yourself in your correspondence." Maggie's stomach dropped to her boots, but she kept her spine straight. She had known this moment might come. Every letter she had written had been carefully worded to avoid mentioning her race, but she had hoped her education and refinement would speak louder than the color of her skin. The townspeople pressed closer, their whispers cutting through the afternoon air like knives. A woman in an elaborate purple dress stepped forward from the crowd. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Well, I never," Eleanor Whitaker declared, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "To think such deception could occur through our postal service. What is this world coming to?" Other voices joined the chorus. Shocked gasps. Disapproving clicks of tongues. Someone suggested she be put on the next stage back east. Another wondered aloud how such arrangements could be better regulated to prevent future incidents. Maggie stood in the center of it all, clutching her leather satchel and maintaining her dignity while her world crumbled around her. She had spent her last dollars on the journey west. There was nothing waiting for her back in Missouri except memories of her father's death and the cotton plantation where she had worked as a bookkeeper until the owner died and his son decided he had no use for her services. The crowd grew thicker. Sheriff Tom Mulligan emerged from his office across the street, his weathered face creased with concern as he assessed the situation. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, ready to maintain order if needed. From the edge of the gathered townspeople, a figure stepped forward. Buck Cartwright had been loading supplies into his wagon when the commotion started. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands that spoke of years working the land. His brown hair needed cutting, and his clothes were clean but well-worn. Buck had heard about the expected bride like everyone else in town. He had even felt a stab of loneliness when folks talked about Harold's good fortune in finding an educated woman willing to make a life on the frontier. Buck's own wife had died 3 winters ago, leaving him alone on a struggling ranch with more problems than solutions. Now he watched the scene unfold with growing anger, not at the woman, but at the cruelty of the crowd. She stood there with perfect posture and quiet grace while they tore her down with their stares and whispers. Something in her dignified silence reminded him of his late wife's strength. The ranch was failing. Buck's cattle had been dying at an alarming rate over the past year. His creditors were circling like vultures. The bank had already threatened foreclosure if he could not make his payments within the next few months. He had come to town today to buy feed he could barely afford, knowing it might not matter if his livestock kept getting sick. But watching the woman face the crowd's hostility with such composure stirred something in his chest. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was his natural instinct to protect those who could not protect themselves. Or maybe it was simple human decency in a moment when everyone else seemed to have forgotten what that meant. Buck stepped through the crowd, his boots echoing on the wooden platform. Conversations died as people turned to see what he intended. Eleanor Whitaker's eyebrows rose in surprise. Sheriff Mulligan's hand shifted slightly on his gun belt. Harold Pembroke looked relieved, probably expecting Buck to escort the woman back to the stagecoach and end this embarrassing scene. The driver was already checking his pocket watch, eager to continue his route. Buck stopped directly in front of Maggie. Her dark eyes met his, and he saw intelligence there along with carefully hidden fear. This was a woman of substance, not some desperate soul looking for any way out of poverty. Her letters to Harold had probably been more honest than most such correspondence, just incomplete in one crucial detail. The entire town held its breath. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension and stood perfectly still in their harnesses. Buck's voice carried clearly across the silent platform when he spoke. "Then just be mine." The wagon ride to Buck's ranch passed in tense silence. Maggie sat beside him on the wooden seat, her back straight, despite the jolting over ruts and stones. The townspeople's shocked faces still burned in her memory. Buck's unexpected offer had saved her from immediate humiliation, but she wondered what price would come with his protection. Buck's hands were steady on the reins as they left Willowbrook behind. He had acted on instinct back at the station. But now reality settled over him like dust from the trail. He had just invited a complete stranger into his failing home. A woman who clearly possessed education and refinement that his rough ranch could never match. The Cartwright property stretched across a valley between rolling hills, but Maggie could see the signs of struggle immediately. Fences sagged in places. The barn needed repairs to its roof. Several cattle grazed near a muddy creek, and even from a distance she could tell they looked thin and unhealthy. The house itself was sturdy but small, 2 stories of weathered wood with a covered porch that had seen better days. Buck pulled the wagon up beside the front steps and climbed down without ceremony. He reached up to help Maggie descend, and she noticed his hands were rough with calluses, but gentle in their assistance. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. Buck had clearly tried to maintain it after his wife's death, but a woman's touch was missing in the bare windows and empty shelves. Maggie set her satchel down in the front room and took in her surroundings without judgment. "You can have the upstairs room," Buck said, his voice gruff with embarrassment. "I sleep down here now. Easier that way." Maggie nodded and climbed the narrow stairs to find a small bedroom with a single window overlooking the pasture. The bed was neatly made with a faded quilt. A simple dresser and washstand completed the furnishings. It was more privacy and comfort than she had dared hope for after the disaster at the station. That evening, Buck prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. They ate in awkward silence at his kitchen table, both uncertain how to navigate their strange new arrangement. Maggie noticed the stack of papers beside Buck's chair, bills and notices with urgent red marks across the tops. "May I ask about your business situation?" Maggie kept her voice careful and respectful. Buck's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Not much business to speak of. Ranch is failing. Been losing cattle for over a year now. Bank wants their money in 3 months or they take the land." Maggie nodded thoughtfully. "What do you believe is causing the cattle deaths?" "Vet says disease. Could be bad feed. Maybe just poor luck." Buck's shoulders sagged with the weight of problems he could not solve. After supper, Maggie asked to see his ledger books. Buck hesitated, clearly embarrassed by his financial records. But something in her calm confidence made him pull the worn volumes from a desk drawer. He watched as she spread the papers across the kitchen table and began examining entries by lamplight. Her trained eye caught patterns immediately. The cattle deaths had started 18 months ago, not 12 as Buck believed. They clustered around certain times of year when the animals relied more heavily on the creek water. The timing coincided with increased activity at the mining operation upstream. When did Consolidated Mining expand their operations? Maggie asked. Buck thought for a moment. Spring before last. They brought in new equipment, started working double shifts. Maggie traced a finger down columns of numbers, her mind working through calculations that would have challenged most businessmen. She had spent 3 years managing the financial operations of Morrison Cotton Trading after the owner's sudden death. His son had been too young and too interested in gambling to handle the complexities, so Maggie had effectively run a business worth thousands of dollars. She had negotiated with banks, tracked commodity prices, and managed supply chains that stretched across 3 states. Her father had taught her arithmetic before his death in a Missouri mining accident. The contaminated water that killed him had sparked her interest in understanding how corporate negligence destroyed lives. "Your cattle are not dying from disease," Maggie said, looking up from the ledgers. "They are being poisoned." Buck stared at her across the table. "Poisoned how?" "The mining operation upstream is contaminating your water source. Look at these patterns." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to specific entries. Deaths increase during dry months when cattle depend more on creek water. They decrease when spring rains provide alternative sources. Buck leaned forward, studying the numbers with new interest. "You can tell all that from my books?" Maggie smiled for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach. "I managed a cotton trading empire for 3 years after my employer died. His records were far more complex than yours, and his problems included everything from crop disease to railroad delays to fluctuating commodity prices." She pulled another ledger closer and flipped through pages of careful entries. "You have excellent instincts for animal husbandry and land management. Your operational decisions are sound. But you need legal recourse against the mining company." Buck sat back in his chair, stunned. He had expected to offer charity to a desperate woman. Instead, she was offering expertise that could save his ranch and his future. "You really think the mine is killing my cattle?" "I am certain of it. The question is whether we can prove it in court and force them to stop before you lose everything." Maggie woke before dawn and found Buck already in the barn tending his horses. She had spent half the night studying his financial records and formulating a plan. The mining company had been dumping waste into the creek system for 18 months. Other ranchers downstream were likely affected too, but none had connected the dots between timing and cattle deaths. Buck looked surprised to see her in the barn wearing a practical work dress instead of her traveling clothes. "Thought you might want to rest after yesterday. We have work to do." Maggie's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex problems. "First, we need water samples from multiple points along the creek. Then we document every cattle death with dates and locations." They spent the morning collecting evidence. Maggie insisted on precise measurements and careful documentation. She had Buck sketch maps showing where each dead animal had been found relative to the water source. Her systematic approach impressed him more with each passing hour. By noon, they had filled 3 glass jars with creek water from different locations. The samples closest to the mining operation showed a distinct metallic smell and slightly cloudy appearance. Maggie labeled each jar with location and date in her precise handwriting. "Now we visit your neighbors," she announced. The first stop was the Henderson Ranch 2 miles south. Jim Henderson greeted Buck warmly, but eyed Maggie with obvious suspicion. Word had already spread about Buck's unusual houseguest. Henderson's wife Martha remained inside the house, rather than come out to meet the woman who had caused such a stir in town. "Lost 6 head this month alone," Henderson admitted, when Buck asked about his cattle. "Figure it's the same sickness you've been fighting." Maggie asked detailed questions about timing and symptoms. Henderson answered Buck directly, as if she were not standing there taking notes. But his information confirmed her theory. His cattle deaths followed the same pattern as Buck's, clustering around periods of high creek dependency. The Williams Ranch yielded similar results. Tom Williams had lost nearly 20 cattle over the past year and was considering selling out before he went completely broke. His wife Sarah actually spoke to Maggie directly, desperate enough for answers to overcome social prejudices. "The animals get lethargic first," Sarah explained. "Then they stop eating. Within a few days they are dead. Nothing we try helps." Maggie recognized the symptoms of heavy metal poisoning from her father's research into mining contamination. He had spent his final months documenting how corporate negligence destroyed farming communities. His notes had become her education in environmental destruction. Back at Buck's ranch that evening, Maggie reorganized all the financial records with military precision. She restructured his debt payments to buy more time and identified which creditors could be negotiated with versus those who demanded immediate payment. Her cotton trading experience had taught her that most financial crises could be managed with proper planning and strategic communication. "You need to write to your creditors immediately," she instructed Buck. "Explain that you have identified the source of your cattle losses and are pursuing legal remedies. Most will accept delayed payments if they believe eventual resolution is likely." Buck watched her work with growing amazement. Her letters to his creditors were professional and persuasive. She negotiated a 3-month extension with the bank by presenting documented evidence of the contamination problem and a detailed plan for legal action. "Where did you learn to do all this?" he asked. "My father was a mining engineer before the accident that killed him. He taught me to research and document problems systematically. When I worked for Morrison Cotton Trading, I dealt with banks, suppliers, and legal disputes regularly. The son inherited the business but had no interest in actually running it." Their working relationship deepened into genuine partnership over the following weeks. Buck handled the physical aspects of ranch work while Maggie managed finances and legal strategy. They made a formidable team, each contributing expertise the other lacked. The romance between them grew naturally from mutual respect and shared goals. Buck had never met a woman who could match his determination and work ethic while bringing skills he desperately needed. Maggie found herself drawn to his quiet integrity and willingness to stand up for what was right, regardless of social pressure. But their investigation was attracting unwanted attention. Eleanor Whitaker made regular visits to neighboring ranches, spreading gossip about the inappropriate arrangement at the Cartwright place. She suggested that Maggie was manipulating Buck for her own purposes and warned other ranchers about trusting outsiders with their business affairs. More concerning were the anonymous notes left at Buck's gate, simple messages warning him to mind his own business and stop stirring up trouble. Someone was watching their activities and did not appreciate their questions about mining operations and water contamination. Sheriff Mulligan visited the ranch one afternoon, ostensibly to check on their welfare, but actually to gather information. Maggie sensed he was more ally than threat. His questions showed genuine concern about environmental damage rather than skepticism about their claims. "Consolidated Mining has powerful friends in the territorial government," Mulligan warned them quietly. "Whatever you're planning, you better have rock-solid evidence." The sheriff's visit confirmed what Maggie already suspected. Their fight was not just against corporate contamination, but against a network of political and financial interests that profited from environmental destruction. The mining company would not surrender their operations without a serious legal battle. That night, Buck asked Maggie to marry him. Not from desperation or gratitude, but from genuine love and respect for the remarkable woman who had transformed his failing ranch into a functioning operation. "Yes," she answered simply. "But first, we finish what we started." The territorial courthouse in Denver was packed when Maggie presented their case. She had spent weeks preparing detailed documentation of water contamination and cattle deaths. Her presentation was methodical and compelling, backed by testimony from affected ranchers and water samples that clearly showed mining waste contamination. Judge Harrison listened intently as Maggie outlined the timeline of environmental damage. She connected Consolidated Mining's expanded operations directly to livestock deaths across 3 ranches. Her financial analysis demonstrated thousands of dollars in losses that could be traced to corporate negligence. Buck sat in the front row, amazed by Maggie's command of legal procedure and scientific evidence. She spoke with the authority of someone who had managed complex business disputes before. Her 3 years running Morrison Cotton Trading had prepared her for exactly this kind of corporate confrontation. The judge ruled in their favor. Consolidated Mining was ordered to immediately cease dumping operations and pay preliminary damages to affected ranchers. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the farming community that had packed the gallery to witness the proceedings. Maggie and Buck returned to Willowbrook as heroes. Even some townspeople who had shunned Maggie began treating her with grudging respect. Her victory in Denver proved she possessed skills and intelligence that transcended social prejudices. Henderson and Williams publicly thanked her for saving their ranches. But their celebration was short-lived. Within days, corporate lawyers descended on Denver like locusts. Consolidated Mining filed immediate appeals and injunctions that effectively suspended the judge's ruling. Their legal team was led by Harvard-trained attorneys with unlimited resources and political connections throughout the territorial government. The mining company's strategy became clear immediately. They would drag the legal proceedings out for years while continuing their profitable operations. Most ranchers lacked the financial resources to sustain extended litigation against corporate lawyers who could afford endless delays and appeals. Nathaniel Voss arrived in Willowbrook personally to oversee the company's response. He was a smooth-talking businessman from Chicago who had built his mining empire through aggressive expansion and political manipulation. Voss checked into the town's best hotel and began meeting privately with local leaders and business owners. Within a week, the atmosphere in town shifted dramatically. Ranchers who had supported Maggie's lawsuit began expressing doubts about continuing their legal fight. Some suggested that perhaps they should accept whatever settlement Consolidated Mining might offer, rather than risk losing everything in prolonged court battles. Tom Williams was the first to withdraw from the lawsuit. He claimed his wife was worried about retaliation and preferred to cut their losses. Jim Henderson followed 2 days later, explaining that he could not afford lawyers for an extended fight against corporate resources. Eleanor Whitaker led a renewed campaign of social pressure against Maggie and Buck. She organized ladies' auxiliary meetings where she expressed concern about outside agitators disrupting their peaceful community. Her influence spread through church groups and social circles like poison in the water supply. Anonymous threats escalated beyond simple warning notes. Buck found dead chickens scattered around his barn one morning. Someone cut his fence lines, allowing cattle to wander onto neighboring property. The harassment was designed to create problems without providing evidence that could lead to arrests. Maggie refused to be intimidated. She continued gathering evidence and preparing legal documents even as their support network crumbled. Her determination impressed Buck, but also worried him. She was fighting a battle that seemed increasingly hopeless against opponents with unlimited resources. The financial pressure intensified when Buck's extended payment agreements began falling apart. Creditors who had accepted delays suddenly demanded immediate payment. His banker suggested that perhaps Buck should reconsider his association with troublemakers who were disrupting business relationships throughout the community. Sheriff Mulligan visited the ranch more frequently, ostensibly to check on their safety, but actually to share information about the investigation he was conducting quietly. He had begun noticing patterns of influence and intimidation that suggested Consolidated Mining's reach extended far beyond simple business operations. Voss has been meeting with territorial officials, Mulligan warned them during one evening visit. Word is he has friends in the capital who owe him favors. Your legal victory might not mean much if the political winds shift. Maggie studied the sheriff carefully. His visits always came after dark, and he seemed genuinely concerned about their welfare despite the social pressure to abandon their cause. She sensed he knew more than he was revealing about Consolidated Mining's operations in the territory. The isolation was taking its toll on both of them. Buck's neighbors avoided him at church and in town. Store owners who had done business with his family for years suddenly became cold and unwelcoming. The social fabric of the community was turning against them under carefully orchestrated pressure. But their relationship deepened under the strain. Maggie and Buck found strength in each other that neither could have sustained alone. Their shared commitment to justice created a bond stronger than the social forces trying to tear them apart. Late one night, as they sat at the kitchen table reviewing legal documents by lamplight, Buck reached across and took Maggie's hand. "Maybe we should consider leaving," he said quietly. "Start over somewhere else where consolidated mining does not control everything." Maggie looked up from the papers spread before them. Her dark eyes reflected the lamp flame but burned with their own inner fire. "My father died fighting corporate contamination in Missouri. I will not run from the same battle here." Buck squeezed her hand gently. "Then we finish this together." Outside, the Colorado wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the promise of a harsh winter and harder battles to come. Sheriff Mulligan had been conducting his own investigation for weeks, following a paper trail that led far beyond Willowbrook. His late-night visits to the Cartwright Ranch were not just social calls. He was building a case that would expose corruption reaching into the territorial government itself. The breakthrough came when Mulligan intercepted correspondence between Nathaniel Voss and territorial officials in Denver. The letters revealed a systematic bribery scheme designed to protect Consolidated Mining's operations from environmental regulations. Judges, legislators, and administrative officials were all receiving regular payments in exchange for favorable rulings and delayed enforcement actions. But the most shocking discovery was buried in Eleanor Whitaker's personal correspondence. Mulligan had obtained a search warrant based on suspicious financial deposits in her bank account. The amounts coincided perfectly with her increased campaign against Maggie and Buck's lawsuit. Eleanor's private papers revealed her role as a paid agent for Consolidated Mining. The company had been funding her social influence campaign from the beginning. Her righteous indignation about moral standards and community values was entirely fabricated to serve corporate interests. The strategy was outlined in chilling detail in Voss's own handwriting. Keep the townspeople focused on racial prejudice and social disruption while the mining company poisoned their water supply. Eleanor's job was to manufacture outrage about Maggie's presence while diverting attention from environmental contamination that threatened every family in the valley. Mulligan found receipts for payments totaling hundreds of dollars over 6 months. Eleanor had been systematically bribed to organize community opposition to the lawsuit. Her ladies' auxiliary meetings, church group discussions, and social pressure campaigns were all purchased and directed by corporate money. The sheriff also discovered evidence of broader intimidation tactics. The anonymous threats, property damage, and economic pressure against Buck were coordinated through intermediaries hired by Consolidated Mining. The company had effectively waged psychological warfare against anyone who challenged their operations. Armed with this evidence, Mulligan called for an emergency town meeting at the church. Word spread quickly through Willowbrook that the sheriff had important information about recent events. Nearly every adult in the community packed into the wooden pews on a cold November evening. Eleanor Whitaker arrived dressed in her finest black dress, expecting to continue her role as moral authority. She had prepared remarks about the need to restore proper social order to their community. Voss sat in the back row, confident that his political connections would protect him from any local challenges. Mulligan stood at the pulpit and began reading from the intercepted correspondence. His voice carried clearly through the silent church as he outlined the bribery scheme that had corrupted territorial officials. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the congregation as the scope of corporate manipulation became clear. When he began reading Eleanor's letters, the reaction was explosive. Her neighbors stared in shock as Mulligan detailed payments made in exchange for organizing community opposition to environmental protection efforts. The woman they had trusted as their moral guide had been bought and paid for by the very company that was poisoning their families. Eleanor's face went white as paper. She tried to interrupt Mulligan's presentation, claiming the documents were forged, but her protests only drew more attention to her guilt. Several townspeople who had supported her campaign against Maggie began demanding explanations for her sudden financial improvements. The most damaging revelation was Voss's written strategy memo. Mulligan read it aloud to the stunned congregation. The corporate plan explicitly stated that racial prejudice should be encouraged and amplified to distract from environmental crimes. Eleanor's job was to keep the community angry about social disruption while ignoring the contamination that threatened their children's health. "While you were arguing about who belonged in this town," Mulligan announced, "your water supply was being systematically poisoned. Your cattle were dying. Your children were drinking contaminated water. All because you were manipulated into focusing on the wrong enemy." Voss stood up from his back row seat and attempted to leave the church, but several angry ranchers blocked his path. The corporate executive who had seemed so powerful and untouchable suddenly looked small and frightened, facing a room full of people who realized they had been deceived and exploited. Eleanor broke down completely under the weight of community anger and her own guilt. She confessed through tears that the mining company had approached her months ago with offers of payment for organizing opposition to the lawsuit. They had exploited her existing prejudices and social position to serve their corporate interests. "They told me the lawsuit would destroy our town's economy," Eleanor sobbed. "They said the woman was just an outside agitator trying to cause trouble for honest businesses." The congregation erupted in angry voices as neighbors who had trusted Eleanor realized the extent of her betrayal. Families who had been turned against each other by manufactured social conflict saw how they had been manipulated by corporate interests that cared nothing for their community's welfare. Sheriff Mulligan restored order and announced that territorial marshals were already en route to arrest corrupted officials in Denver. Consolidated Mining's operations would be shut down immediately pending a full investigation. The company would face criminal charges for bribery, environmental destruction, and conspiracy. The townspeople who had shunned Maggie and Buck began approaching them with apologies and expressions of support. They finally understood that the real threat to their community had never been the educated woman who challenged corporate power, but the corporation itself and those who served its interests. Jim Henderson stood up in the crowded church and addressed Maggie directly for the first time since she had arrived in Willowbrook. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. You were trying to save our ranches while we were fighting the wrong battle." Within days of Sheriff Mulligan's revelations, territorial marshals arrived to arrest Nathaniel Voss and several corrupted officials. Consolidated Mining's operations were immediately shut down, pending a full investigation into environmental crimes and government bribery. The mining equipment that had poisoned the valley for 18 months finally fell silent. Voss faced federal charges for conspiracy, bribery, and environmental destruction. His corporate empire crumbled as investors fled and government contracts were canceled. The man who had seemed untouchable just weeks earlier was led away in shackles, his political connections powerless to save him from the weight of evidence Sheriff Mulligan had compiled. Eleanor Whitaker received a lighter sentence in exchange for her full cooperation with the investigation. The territorial court sentenced her to 2 years of community service focused on environmental restoration efforts. She would spend her time helping to repair the damage her actions had enabled, working alongside the very people she had turned against Maggie and Buck. The financial settlements came swiftly once corporate lawyers could no longer delay proceedings through political manipulation. Consolidated Mining was forced to pay substantial damages to every affected rancher in the valley. Buck received enough compensation to clear all his debts and modernize his entire operation. More importantly, the company was required to fund complete environmental restoration of the contaminated water system. Teams of engineers worked through the winter to remove mining waste and restore the creek to its natural condition. By spring, the water ran clear again for the first time in nearly 2 years. Buck's cattle began recovering immediately once they had access to clean water. His herd grew stronger and healthier with each passing month. The ranch that had been on the verge of foreclosure became profitable again as livestock thrived in the restored environment. Other ranchers experienced similar recoveries. Jim Henderson and Tom Williams publicly apologized to Maggie for doubting her expertise and withdrawing from the lawsuit. They credited her investigation and determination with saving not just their ranches, but their families' health and futures. The broader impact extended far beyond individual financial recoveries. Maggie's victory established legal precedents for environmental protection throughout the Colorado Territory. Future mining operations would face stricter regulations and oversight designed to prevent similar contamination disasters. Sheriff Mulligan was promoted to territorial marshal in recognition of his integrity and investigative skills. His willingness to challenge corruption at the highest levels of government earned him respect throughout the territory. He used his new position to establish better communication networks between local law enforcement and federal oversight agencies. The transformation of Willowbrook's social fabric was even more remarkable than the environmental restoration. The community that had been divided by manufactured prejudice and corporate manipulation began healing as neighbors understood how they had been deceived and exploited. Maggie and Buck's wedding took place on a perfect spring morning in the town church. Nearly every resident of Willowbrook attended the ceremony, a dramatic change from the hostile reception Maggie had received just months earlier. The same people who had whispered cruel gossip now brought gifts and offered genuine congratulations. Sarah Williams served as Maggie's matron of honor, their friendship having grown strong through shared struggles against corporate intimidation. Martha Henderson helped decorate the church with wildflowers from the restored valley. Even some of Eleanor's former allies participated in welcoming Maggie as a permanent member of their community. The ceremony was simple, but deeply moving. Buck and Maggie exchanged vows that emphasized partnership, mutual respect, and shared commitment to justice. Their love had been tested by social pressure and corporate retaliation, emerging stronger and more genuine than relationships built on convenience or circumstance. Following the wedding, Maggie established herself as a business consultant specializing in helping struggling ranchers with financial management and legal issues. Her success in defeating Consolidated Mining had demonstrated expertise that was desperately needed throughout the territory. Ranchers traveled from neighboring counties to seek her advice on everything from debt restructuring to environmental protection. Maggie's systematic approach to problem solving and her experience with corporate legal tactics made her invaluable to farming communities facing similar challenges. The Cartwright Ranch became a model of efficient operation and environmental stewardship. Buck handled the practical aspects of livestock management, while Maggie managed finances, legal affairs, and strategic planning. Their partnership proved that combining different skills and perspectives created stronger outcomes than either could achieve alone. Sheriff Mulligan made regular visits to check on their progress and seek Maggie's advice on other environmental crimes he was investigating. Her ability to trace corporate financial networks and identify patterns of corruption had become legendary among law enforcement officials throughout the territory. 6 months after their wedding, Maggie and Buck were working in their garden when the afternoon stagecoach arrived in Willowbrook. They could see the dust cloud from their porch and hear the familiar sounds of horses and wheels that had marked Maggie's own arrival in what seemed like another lifetime. This time, a young Chinese woman stepped down from the coach, carrying a worn satchel and looking around with the same mixture of hope and anxiety that Maggie remembered so clearly. The townspeople gathered to observe the new arrival, but their faces showed curiosity rather than hostility. Maggie set down her gardening tools and walked toward town, Buck following close behind. The woman stood alone on the platform, clearly uncertain about her reception in this unfamiliar place. "Welcome to Willowbrook," Maggie said, extending her hand in greeting. "I am Maggie Cartwright. This is my husband, Buck. We would be honored to help you get settled." The young woman's face brightened with relief and gratitude. "My name is Lee Wei. I have come to marry Mr. Patterson, but I fear there may be complications." Maggie smiled warmly, remembering her own fears and the unexpected kindness that had changed her life forever. "Then you will stay with us until everything is properly arranged."